playback. The link to the recording will be posted on the JRSA website and emailed to attendees. Today's webinar is being audiocast via the speakers on your computer. If you do not have speakers or you'd prefer to use your phone, please use the number contained in your registration email or on the event tab located on the top left-hand side of the screen. There's many people joining us today, so we have automatically muted the lines of participants to reduce background noise. If you're not a presenter, please keep your phone muted. If you typed in *6 to unmute your phone, please retype it in to remute your phone. If you have questions for the presenters, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. And if you're going to do that, please select Host and Presenter from the drop-down menu next to the text box. If you'd like to communicate with JRSA staff during the webinar, please submit your comment using the chat feature to Jason Trask or to Host. Now, this session is scheduled for 1 hour and 30 minutes, and it'll end promptly at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you used to join the session initially. You can also call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. That's 1-866-229-3239. Now, in the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, we will ask you to complete a short survey. The information you provide will help us to plan and improve future webinars and meet our reporting requirements. So, with all that being said, I'd like to provide you a little information about our speakers today. Our first speaker today will be Sarah Lepore-Dubé. Ms. Dubé is the manager of the Pew-MacArthur Results First Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust, where she helps advance the use of cost-benefit analysis and cultivate a climate for evidence-based decision-making that can enable states to shift resources to programs that generate the best outcomes. Before joining Pew in November 2009, Ms. Dubé managed evaluation and planning projects for a range of nonprofit and philanthropic clients. Ms. Dubé holds a master's degree in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in history and child development from Tufts University. Our next speaker will be Mark Shabsis. He's the cost-benefit coordinator for the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, DCJS. This is a multifunctional support agency with a wide range of responsibilities that includes the collection and analysis of statewide crime data, the administration of federal and state funds, and the support of public safety-related agencies across the state through research and best practice recommendations. Additionally, the division serves as the state's Statistical Analysis Center and the state administering agency for funding from the Federal Office of Justice Programs. Our next speaker will be Lisa Laurent Sampson. Lisa is the Director of Research and Policy Analysis Division for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety and Security and Director of the Massachusetts Statistical Analysis Center. The goal of the SAC is to increase the use of criminal justice data from across the Commonwealth to inform and guide policy, enhance data sharing and networking, and promote the use of evidence-based programs and practices in state government. Ms. Sampson has been involved with the Results First project since joining the Research and Policy Analysis Division in December 2011 and leads the data team in this effort. She has a Master's of Social Work degree from Boston University. And with that, I'd like to now turn it over to our presenters And I'd like to introduce Sarah Dubé. Sarah?
Thanks, Mark. Looks like I now have hosting capabilities. Can everyone see that blue screen still? Mark, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mark, and thanks so much to everyone at JRSA for organizing what I know will be a great event. As Mark said, I'm Sarah Dubé, manager of the Pew-MacArthur Results First Initiative, and I'm joining the webinar today to give you a brief overview of Results First, to talk a little bit about our work across the country, and then share just a few examples of the successes that many of our partner states have already achieved before handing it over to Mark and Lisa to talk about their state's own work with Results First in more detail. So the Pew-MacArthur Results First Initiative, as you may have guessed, is a joint project of the Pew Charitable Trusts and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Pew and MacArthur launched Results First in 2010. We started actively working with states in early 2011, so we've been around for about 3 years now. We started with a simple yet ambitious mission, which is to help policymakers across the country identify and invest in what works. There we go. So I think we can all agree that government leaders want to make strategic budget choices that result in both the best outcomes and make the best use of taxpayer dollars. But in times of fiscal constraint, often have to rely on things like incremental budgeting and across-the-board cuts. And while, of course, there are many, many factors at play, policymakers lack critical information needed to make tough decisions, such as the full scope of programs that agencies provide and how much those programs cost. And if policymakers are lucky enough to have that sort of information, it's rare that programs measure outcomes in a consistent way, making it difficult for leaders to say with certainty whether or not programs have accomplished their goals and then how those programs compare to one another. So that's really what Results First does. It helps to address this critical policy challenge and fill this information gap, providing policymakers across the country with the information that they need to make difficult decisions. So you might be thinking that all sounds well and good, but how the heck does Results First do that? Well, Results First employs what we call an innovative approach to cost-benefit analysis. Instead of just assessing the cost-benefit ratio for a single program, this model analyzes multiple programs through the same lens, enabling policymakers to make true apples-to-apples comparisons about very different programs. So it is a complicated approach, and I know that Mark and Lisa will get into a lot more detail about the technical components of this model. But at the 30,000-foot level, it does three main things. First, it draws on an extensive national research base. Staff and our research partners at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, or WISIP, have reviewed tens of thousands of program evaluations over the better part of 2 decades and assessed them according to a strict set of criteria. Using only the best of those studies, they aggregate the expected outcomes using meta-analysis, resulting in clear predictions of a program's effectiveness. Next, the model estimates the expected outcomes if the program that's being studied were to be implemented in your state, based on the state's unique population characteristics. Again, Mark and Lisa will be covering the types of data involved in this in much more detail, but the first 2 steps are really about taking the national research and then applying that expected effect size or the expected effect of a program to a state's own population. And then third, the model uses your state's own fiscal data to calculate what those expected benefits would be worth over time, resulting in a state-specific return on investment estimate for each program for which there is research available in that national research base. So this approach is really bringing the best of both worlds to bear: rigorous national research on a variety of programs, and then state-specific population and cost data. So after running the model for several programs in your state, you can generate what we call a consumer reports type list that ranks programs based on the benefits and costs that each is predicted to generate for both taxpayers and for society. This is a sample ranking from Washington State. Again, great examples of the work that's been happening in Washington State for about 2 decades now, that predicts the costs, benefits, and return on investment of a selection of adult and juvenile justice programs. So we start on the left-hand side here by developing a program inventory, meaning identifying all of the programs that your state provides and then figuring out which of those match the programs in the model's national research base. Then moving along to the right, we determine what those programs cost. So this is already some critical data that's helping to fill that information gap for policymakers. This may be information that policymakers haven't had before, so we're already starting by identifying the full scope of programs that are offered in a given policy area and then what they cost. So already we're off to a great start. But I would say that the real power of this tool comes in the next two steps, which is calculating the long-term benefits associated with each program and then comparing those benefits to one another. So we have over time, that depends on the cohort that your state selects, and I know again that Mark will be covering that, but we're able to look at the long-term benefits to both taxpayers and society of what investing in a program like cognitive behavioral therapy would be worth to any given state, and then what that ratio would, what the cost-benefit ratio would be also in that state. So, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy is generating $25 for every dollar invested for Washington State. So that's obviously a great bang for the buck. So this is not only providing policymakers with critical information about evidence-based programs, so again, already filling that information gap, but it's also really helping move beyond just a list of information or just an organizational tool, information gathering tool, to a true decision-making tool that helps policymakers compare and select the best investment choices for your state. Obviously, this audience is focused on criminal justice, so that's what we're talking about today, but I should mention that the model is also able to assess child welfare, pre-K-12 education, substance abuse, and mental health programs. All the states we've been working with have started with adult and juvenile justice, which we'll be hearing a lot more about today, but there are several states that have expressed interest in expanding to these other areas, which, as I'm sure you all are well aware, many outcomes in the criminal justice arena are connected with the outcomes in many other social policy areas. So we think that's an exciting development down the road, and we're happy to chat more about that offline if you'd like. So as I mentioned, this portfolio, this consumer reports list, is an example of the great work that's been happening in Washington State. But after working out in the states for about 3 years now, we're seeing many other states across the country doing work that we think is just as exciting. So we're currently working in 14 states and 3 California counties across a variety of geographic and political contexts, as you can see on this map here. We're in big states, little states, red states, and blue states, all across the nation. And we're also, as you can see those 3 dots in California, we are working in 3 California counties. That's Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Fresno. And when I say that we're working in all of these jurisdictions, I mean that we're helping states and counties build their own capacity to conduct these analyses in an ongoing way. Again, as you'll hear from Mark and Lisa, New York and Massachusetts, as well as many of these other states, have really embraced this work and made it their own. So instead of just implementing a standard model, we're really working with states like New York and Massachusetts to develop the New York Results First model and the Massachusetts Results First model, and make sure that this is a resource that will be available to the state for many years to come. So we provide the software, which is pretty much Excel on steroids with a Visual Basic overlay to make it a little more user-friendly. We train staff like Mark and Lisa, and we provide ongoing technical assistance, both in person and remotely. So the true technical side of technical assistance is a big part of what we do. And then more of what my job is, and then several other folks on our team, is to help translate this to the policy world. So we meet with key stakeholders throughout the implementation process to think through ways to use the model in policy and budget deliberations. And then when we're coming to the point of releasing results, my team and I help interpret results and present them to policymakers, and then share the information and lessons learned across the state. So this webinar today is a great example of the work that we've been trying to facilitate by having states talk with one another and share lessons learned and information. And we know that I think several of our partners are on the webinar today, and those who aren't able to make it are really excited about seeing the recording down the road. So this is definitely in line with the capacity building and the kind of community of practice that we're working to develop. And one other thing that I should mention too, as we continue to expand the technical assistance we provide, we are working to expand the model itself. So that means adding programs to the existing components, so adding different adult and juvenile justice programs to the model, to that the national research base, and then also looking at some other policy areas like healthcare that states are really interested in doing. And then we are also starting to improve on the software itself. The model that we have now was developed by Washington State, and it really does kind of push the technical limits of Excel and Visual Basic. So we are working to continue to make this as user-friendly as possible down the road. But again, it really, at this point, it's just an Excel-based model, but we are hoping to move that to something a little more sophisticated down the road. So this is a pretty map, but you may be asking, what have all of these states been up to? Well, we measure success in a few ways. In 2013 alone, 6 states, Connecticut, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont, implemented state-specific versions of the Results First model and presented results to key stakeholders in a variety of settings, like committee hearings, testimony, and formal reports. 3 states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont, enacted legislation incorporating Results First into their policymaking processes. So that's very much in line with the capacity building component that we're working with states on, to have Results First truly be ingrained into the way that policy and budget decisions are made over time. 2 states, Illinois and Iowa, use their models to analyze legislation, avoiding millions of potential costs. And then 5 states, again, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont, use their models to target nearly $38 million in funding through investing in highly effective evidence-based programs. So that's just a quick snapshot of the successes that states using the Results First approach across the country have already experienced, and we really are just at the beginning. We're excited and encouraged by the great work that all of our state and county partners are doing so far to identify and invest in what works, and are really eager to continue working with policymakers across the country to achieve the best outcomes that make the best use of taxpayer dollars. So with that overview, and this is my contact information. If anyone would like to shoot me an email offline, please feel free to do that. But with that, I will turn it over to Mark Shapsis from New York.
Mark, you now have control of the slide deck. You may have your phone muted.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mark Shapsis. I am the Cost-Benefit Coordinator for the State of New York Division of Criminal Justice Services. I want to thank the moderator, Mark Myron, and JERSA, of course, for hosting this webinar. As Mark Myron mentioned, DCJS, we do quite a bit to support criminal justice at the state and local level here in New York. Some of what our agency does is listed right here, involving we are the repository for crime data here in the state of New York, and we also do a lot of research and analysis and best practice recommendation for use by both state entities and local law enforcement and local criminal justice. Since we have a pretty broad audience participating today, I just wanted to kind of set the table by giving a quick overview of what criminal justice looks like here in New York State. Local law enforcement is largely decentralized in New York. We have over 500 local police agencies. This results in about 600,000 arrests annually. About half of that, 300,000, come out of New York City, and the rest of it are from the other 57 non-New York City counties. Looking at the supervision and incarceration side of the house, we have 62 individually run probation departments supervising more than 100,000 offenders on probation. We also have 58 local jail systems, 1 from New York City, and 57 in the non-New York City counties. The jail in New York State is for persons awaiting trial and also persons sentenced to a year or less of incarceration, generally misdemeanor offenders. And then we also have our state-run Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, which is a single state agency that combines running the state prisons and providing state parole supervision of released felony inmates in the community. So we have approximately 55,000 felony inmates incarcerated and another 36,000 parolees under supervision at any given time here in New York State. So as for New York's interest in cost-benefit analysis, this first quote here of research tells us what works, cost-benefit tells us if what works is worth the cost. This quote really sold our deputy secretary, and the deputy secretary in New York, that would be like the governor's cabinet advisor in charge of all public safety a few years back. And from that time, we were kind of off and running. And CBA was a good fit here in New York for several reasons. The first and foremost being is that the structure and the fact that we have our Division of Criminal Justice Services, which is a repository, a centralized repository for data, allowed us to very quickly and easily get our hands on some of the required data elements needed to run this model. Also, we have strong research capability both within DCJS and at several of our agencies. For instance, a large agency such as the Department of Corrections even has their own research arm staffed by many talented individuals. And of course, our executive here had a commitment to efficiency and fiscal austerity that just kind of comes with the times nowadays. So where does Results First live in New York State? The short answer is in the executive branch. Here you kind of see the structure, and this is the governor, obviously the Dep Secretary that I was just talking about, the cabinet position. And it's actually DCJS, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, where I work, is responsible for the technical implementation and the operation of the model. However, the output from it is utilized by essentially everybody you see on this page here. So it's housed within the executive branch, operated by DCJS, but really utilized by, right up to the DepSec for public safety and the governor's office as well. So let's now kind of start getting a little bit more technical. Sarah just explained kind of some of the steps that the model uses to monetize and predict outcomes, but I'd like to take that a little bit further and talk in detail about some of the data requirements needed to feed the model, if this is something that you are potentially interested in pursuing in your state. So from a big picture, the model works by relying on a meta-analysis of national research, and then it applies the effect of that research to the correctional population and supervision population within each state. So it's applying it customized to the trajectory of New York offenders in our case. And then it uses simulations to translate this predicted change in recidivism, the effect of the programming, into an estimate of both reduced victimizations and fiscal savings. And from the policy side, we then use that information to try and put together a portfolio of what programming will achieve the best results at the lowest cost. So from a data needs perspective, there's really 4 areas or components which drive the modeling process. And throughout my presentation, you're going to see kind of these 4 areas several times. The meta-analysis evidence base, then the individualized recidivism trajectory for your individual state. Then we have a resource use probability tree, and of course, the cost component. So we'll start off by talking about the meta-analytic evidence base for a moment. And this is a nice place to start because it pretty much comes ready to use, prepackaged, and there's not a lot of individual work that the states have to do here. What this is a compilation of evaluations on the criminal justice side. There's more than 250 of them, and I think there's about 400 or 500 additional program evaluations in the other programming areas that Sarah discussed earlier, such as early education. And you know, this has been vetted and put together by the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, and you know, I'll show you what an example of this looks like. Here's an example of a meta-analysis summary. This one, the program modality happens to be mental health courts. And the nice thing is that the studies and evaluations on a pretty regular basis are being refreshed and expanded by WISUP, the creator of the meta-analysis, to include new and relevant research as it becomes available. So this is kind of the engine behind the results first model that drives the effect that the different programming modalities can expect on various populations. So if the meta-analysis component had the lightest state lift, the recidivism component definitely is the heaviest lift as far as state customization goes. The good news here is that this type of work is likely something that people on this call are already quite familiar with. One thing I will say is that access to, or the ability to gain access to, criminal history and judicial disposition and sentencing data is absolutely paramount. It's a must. It's needed to do the modeling, the recidivism modeling that will drive the model here in your state. Here in New York, this wasn't really a problem, and DCJS serves as the central repository for this type of information, but it's definitely something to keep in mind that case-level data is needed to go ahead to perform the analyses required to feed the results first tool. Recidivism, results first style. So this is a summary of the fairly unique measures of recidivism that are used within the results first model. Cumulative failure rate, you know, it's a terminal measure. Time to offender's first reconviction, it's sort of an inverse survival curve, and then a hazard distribution as well, which is the risk of a reconviction over the follow-up period. The follow-up period that you're studying offenders for, and over which you're going to monetize benefits or reduce victimizations, is customizable. Here in New York, we decided to use a 5-year follow-up period, but our hazard distribution showed the risk during any one of our 5 years, regardless of the number of times an offender is recidivating, not a terminal event. These first two inputs for the model are actually put in through a series of best fit parameter curves, but you know, like I said, that's just from a technical perspective. Crime type probability, the third one, this step requires mapping each of your state offenses to 7 broad categories of offenses that are used in the model. Then we have trips through the system. It's fairly straightforward, which is the number of reconviction trips per offender during the follow-up time period. And then it really even gets as granular as offenses per trip. So here we're counting the multiple counts or multiple charges during a single trip through the system. And the reason that the model gets this granular is if we're to be able to understand the probability and the likelihood of the offenses to be avoided and likely the savings to be avoided, that we really need to understand how an offender is taxing the criminal justice system through reoffending, other than just a simple failure or non-failure as a terminal event. So there's a lot to do here to establish this baseline recidivism trajectory, but again, it's something that it's the type of work that we've all done, you know, in detail. Here, just as an example, is some of New York's curves. You look at, you know, our baseline curves. The Results First tool is designed for felony offenders. Looking here at the graph on the left, you see the 5-year recidivism trajectory for a first reconviction. You know, and you see actually in New York, our jailed offenders are the highest cumulative failure rate over a 5-year period, even more so than our felons sent to prison. Then you also have the ability to narrow these cohorts down into sub-cohorts, you know, either by risk or by age, and there's just an example of our prison cohort based on risk level, and you can see a high-risk prisoner has a 69% chance of a reconviction within 5 years. One of our low-risk prisoners, still a felon, but sentenced to prison, but still down only at 17%. So New York, actually, right now we're using 7 main offender populations. Here's some of the similar detail just presented in a tabular form. And what this is really just, you know, how the system responds, well, how the system is going to be anticipated to respond to crime. And here you can see, you know, that bottom line across the bottom, you know, based on the offenders, not only is there a failure event, but the number of failure events is, of course, going to drive resource use as well. Moving on to the resource use probability tree, some of the other inputs you're going to need, and this is really just how the system is going to respond to a conviction in your state, both in terms of sanction type and sanction duration. Here is an example for New York State. We had to compile this data. For instance, for a felony robbery conviction, there's a 52% chance that that person is going to, conviction for felony robbery is going to wind up in a prison term, 14% chance that that robber is going to go to jail, 10% that they're going to wind up on a split sentence, and so on and so forth. So this is the type of analyses that you'll have to do to put together these data elements that will feed the model, again, because the model needs to know what the cost on the system is going to be in response to a recidivistic event so that it can calculate a change in the cost of response, assuming the programming we're going to deliver is going to drive the recidivism trajectory down. So in addition to the probability of the various sanctions used shown in that top table, you also need to know the duration of each sanction, you know, essentially the quantity of the resource use that is displayed there in that second little table. These are just examples of the data elements and the level of granularity that is required to operate the model. And then, since this is a cost-benefit analysis, of course you need operating costs for the various components of your criminal justice system. And what is required here are marginal operating costs. And here are some examples of the costs in New York State, marginal costs, mind you. And this may be an area where you need to forge some new partnerships with budget or finance offices, either a division of budget or finance offices within individual agencies. You know, we certainly did here in New York to put together some of these figures. And it's also something that, again, you have to get policymakers and budget personnel comfortable with using marginal costs that are relevant and appropriate to the scale of change that, you know, we would expect to see upon the system based on the type of programming we're delivering. So these are just some New York State examples here. But wait, there's more. Lastly, you will also need to source programming-related inputs. And on this front, it's the actual program delivery costs, what it costs to offer these various program modalities in your state. There are really three primary elements here, and they are the cost per participant, the length of the program to run, and then what population that program is targeted to. That being said, you really also need a good program description and an understanding of current operating capacity, whether a program is operating at excess or capacity, or if there's a need for a certain type of programming, either in a specific geographic region or among a certain type of subpopulation of persons with need. It's really key to understand kind of what programming is available in your state currently before going ahead and simulating and trying to adjust portfolios based on the information here in the model. The program delivery costs are of course used to calculate net benefit and ROI, the return on investment for providing particular programming. And you know, this can be a whole webinar in and of itself, and in fact, it was a whole webinar in and of itself. Pew recently just did a webinar that links here and will be available for you to view if you want to understand a little bit more about what putting together a program inventory looks like for Results First. So just some closing thoughts on what to expect if you are going to take on Results First or cost-benefit analysis in general in your state. Implementation, you know, that's where we start. That's where New York started about 2 years ago. And this consists of data gathering, populating the model. There's roughly 1,000 data points that needed to be populated. You know, we had some fits and starts, but it took us, you know, the better part of a year actually to do implementation, you know, to actually be able to get and gather all the data elements, and that was even with us having the criminal history and sentencing disposition data at our fingertips. And so, you know, even putting that aside, it did take some time to get through the implementation stage. Customization, there will be customization that is required. You know, it's certainly, even though we're very thankful to Pew and MacArthur for taking this, you know, wonderful computer tool developed by Washington State and kind of franchising it out with technical assistance to interested states. It is, you know, it's not one size fits all. You know, parameters such as follow-up length and, you know, based on what sentencing structure looks like in your state, it will likely require customization or workarounds because the original technical model, the computerized tool, was developed based on, you know, the sentencing structure of Washington State, and like I said, it's different in every state. So there's definitely some customization that's involved, but that's a good thing because doing that type of work requires you to get really familiar with the technical aspect of what the model's doing and makes it so that you can explain that to your policy principals and it's not just a black box type of situation. And then where New York is right now is, you know, we've done production for a while, and utilization, we've issued a first report. We're about to issue a second. A few tips that I would say is that, you know, important is to sell this as a tool, not a panacea. We tailor the work product to the audience, whether it be DOB, whether it be our corrections folks, when we're working with folks, you know, that are at the local level as well. We try and, you know, be sensitive to everyone's coming at this from a different perspective. Sensitive, obviously, to the big P politics, and you know, we wanted to position this, and this speaks to something that Sarah said at the end of her presentation was that the way we kind of embedded this in New York was as a principle of doing business, of operations, of the annual budgeting. We didn't need to pass legislation in here in New York State requiring, cost-benefit model, but we were trying to embed essentially just as the routine way of doing business and making decisions in a thoughtful manner, that requires the use of cost-benefit work. And we also kind of position it as ongoing research because that enables us to, go ahead and generate reports in these consumer report lists and kind of roll out on our schedule as opposed to, it being a ends justify the means type of exercise when, someone gets an idea on a hunch. So with that, I would invite you to, take a peek at our first report. It's on our website there. This webinar will be available for download. If I did it correctly, that'll be a hyperlink. You could click right through to it to take a look at our first report. And we're excited about this work. We're thankful to Pew-MacArthur for the technical expertise they've lent us throughout this process. And it's something that has really been embraced here, both from within the research community in New York and also from, our policymakers straight up through the governor's office. Because really, the more information that we can provide to the decision makers to make rational evidence-based decisions, the better position they are to go ahead and drive the type of results they're hoping to see. So with that, I thank you, and I'll now turn the webinar over to my colleague from Massachusetts, Lisa Sampson. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. You're a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, everyone. Just move my slide here. Okay, thank you to JRSA for inviting me to speak on this webinar. This part of the webinar is really geared to those states that are just starting or considering starting on the Results First path. The Results First project in Massachusetts has been led by the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security and the Massachusetts Statistical Analysis Center, which is where the model is currently housed. Our strategy has been to work with our criminal justice partner agencies, build on existing collaborations, and form new collaborations to implement Results First in our state. So this is a big thank you slide to our team in Massachusetts. I'd like to recognize the key players of our Mass team for their many contributions to date and the work that continues. As you can see, a large number of people and agencies have been involved with this project, and I apologize in advance if I've left anyone off the list. I'd especially like to thank Assistant Secretary of Public Policy Michael Coelho for his vision and leadership on this project, and our Pew technical consultants Steve Lies, Sarah Dubé, and others on the Pew Results First team who have guided us along the way. Additionally, I want to thank BJS for awarding state justice statistics funds and BJA, and Burn Justice Assistance Grant funds to support the work of our Research and Policy Analysis Division and Massachusetts Statistical Analysis Center on Results First. So Results First got its start in Massachusetts with legislative language in 2011 that established the Special Commission on Criminal Justice. This was a legislative response to the many criminal justice reforms filed by the administration and concern about projected increases in the prison population and rising costs to the criminal justice system. At that time, our state prison system was at 143% overcrowding. The commission was charged with, and I quote, investigating the feasibility of developing an application for technical assistance from nationally recognized criminal justice reform programs with a data-driven approach to develop bipartisan legislation that would reduce correction spending and utilize the savings to reduce crime, strengthen public safety, and fund other budget priorities. Priority was to be given to technical assistance at no cost to the state, and this led us to Results First. The Special Commission on Criminal Justice is chaired by Secretary of Public Safety Andrea Cabral, and its membership includes agency leaders from key components of the adult and juvenile criminal justice system, the legislature, and governor appointees with expertise in mental health, substance abuse, addiction treatment, offender supervision, and services in juvenile justice. So this group has really served in an advisory capacity to the project, providing support and guidance as Results First rolls out. Commission members receive regular updates and presentations on the program and work of Results First. In 2013, the Commission was made a standing commission by Massachusetts General Law. So our Massachusetts model strategies from the onset, we've had buy-in from the top and strong established relationships with many of the agency's researchers, program staff, and budget analysts from which to draw on and build our teams. Some of the strategies for implementing Results First in our state have been to hold informational webinars, provide updates and present to stakeholders, meet with administration and finance and key legislators from the House and Senate, establish Results First working groups, and bring in the Results First team for key presentations and meetings. Having the Results First experts to present with us has provided support by offering a national perspective and multiple years of experience working in depth with the model and delivering presentations to a variety of audiences. So I want to talk a little bit about our collaborations and teams. Since embarking on Results First about 2 years ago, Massachusetts has developed 3 working groups to compile the data needed for the model. We've integrated the Pew team on calls and established regular check-ins with them, have held webinars and training sessions with working group members, and have provided updates and presented interim findings to stakeholders. The 3 working groups have been instrumental in our progress with Results First. The recidivism group has built the recidivism and resource use data for the model, all of those data components that Mark was talking about previously. Our marginal costs group has been focused on compiling data on system costs, and the program mapping group has been working with each agency to compile an inventory of evidence-based programs targeted towards reducing recidivism. The teams have developed over time. My suggestion to those starting out in other states would be to identify key people for your teams up front, assign project managers, and establish regular check-in times. Most likely people are geographically dispersed throughout the state, so having a conference call line and some means of posting and sharing documents securely is really important. Your goal is for everyone on your team to be able to communicate and access shared information. I'd like to focus a little bit on our recidivism work group because this collaboration and the work of this group has really been extraordinary, and so much has to do with the relationships that have developed over time previous to the Results First work starting up in March 2012. The recidivism work group came together effortlessly, and participants enthusiastically supported the work, although it meant taking on additional work to capture the recidivism and resource use data needed for the model. So we were provided free technical assistance, but the work involved with implementing this model has taken a lot of time and effort. So many of the researchers in our group represent a division of 1 in their agencies, but this was a very productive group, and we were successful because we already had a strong research foundation in place through our Mass Criminal Justice Agency Researchers Group. This is a group that had been meeting informally for over a decade and had collaborated on research projects and established a strong professional network. Individuals from our group joined our recidivism and programs work group. So this long-established network greatly facilitated the progress of providing the recidivism data, which is integral to implementing the Results First model. And in addition, because of some previous research collaborations on recidivism, our Massachusetts Sentencing Commission had already conducted a comprehensive recidivism study in earlier years and had laid the foundation for our recidivism work. And I just also want to mention that the Pew team has really been a partner in this effort and has led multiple training sessions, webinars, participated in presentations, meeting, work group conference calls. So our Pew technical consultant, Steve Lies, has really been a constant presence on our phone calls, and his expertise and background in the model has been invaluable to our work. Okay, so to generate the data needed for the Results First model, Results First requires data to establish baseline outcomes for the state to determine the projected impact and benefit of the programs covered in the model. So listed here are some of the data measures collected by the recidivism work group. Mark had alluded or talked actually at length about these in his presentation. Long-term recidivism measures are needed for each agency cohort. For the resource use component, each agency contributed data on years per resource use or average time served at the agency. For example, the Department of Correction provided data on average time served for an offender prior to their release from prison. Using data from the Massachusetts Survey of Sentencing Practices, published by our Massachusetts Sentencing Commission, we developed statistics on the probability of sentence or supervision at conviction. Marginal costs capture the incremental costs of adding one more person to the system, whether it be parole, probation, county, or state corrections, et cetera. There's victimization costs needed for the model, and of course, what we've mentioned already previously, the evidence-based programming inventory. So the recidivism measurements that Massachusetts used for Results First are shown here. The Washington State Institute of Public Policy used a 15-year follow-up for their recidivism outcomes. The farthest back that our agencies could develop a comprehensive release cohort was 2005, particularly for our county release cohort, which is based on, which is run out of the 14 Massachusetts county and are run independently by elected sheriffs. The recidivism work by the group provides an example of how we work together as a team to develop the information needed for the model. The Massachusetts Sentencing Commission's research department, led by Linda Holt, had already developed SPSS code to read Massachusetts court arraignment records for an earlier recidivism study. So working with the recidivism group, the Sentencing Commission updated the SPSS programs to incorporate the new recidivism counting rules and share these programs with the work group. The agency cohorts were grouped into the Massachusetts offense categories, and recidivism outcomes defined as reconviction for an offense were collected by the most serious offense. Over 44,000 records were submitted to the Massachusetts Sentencing Commission, representing releases to the street from the Department of Youth Services, Houses of Correction, releases to parole, supervision, new risk need supervision cases for adults and youth on probation. And then the Massachusetts Department of Correction used the Sentencing Commission's code to collect their agency recidivism outcomes on offenders released from the Department of Correction. The recidivism work group held weekly phone calls to discuss counting rules, review results, and we did some on-site data validation at the Mass Sentencing Commission's research division. We developed a county release data set using proxy data from our case management system with parole, and our Hampden County and parole researchers compared data across the two systems and documented data quality concerns. So our work on the Results First implementation continues. We're in the process of compiling the recidivism data based on extending the follow-up period from 6 to 7 years. We've successfully loaded the Results First model to get cost-benefit results for evidence-based programs offered at the Massachusetts Department of Correction. Our program inventory work continues as we work with each agency to gather information and cost data on their programs and match them up with the inventory of evidence-based programming included in the Results First model. Pew has developed new tools to help Results First states match their programs with those in the model, so we will learn about and incorporate these new tools. We're updating a documentation manual of sources, dates, and methodologies used to collect the model inputs, and we'll be writing briefs reporting on Results First information and data. We are hiring additional staff to support the Results First work and hope to see a dedicated team of people working on the model shortly. Additionally, Mass is interested in expanding to new policy areas of the model, including child welfare, education on the pre-K to 12 grades, substance abuse, and mental health. The Results First work in Mass has produced many benefits, some of which are listed here. It's brought together teams of people with similar areas of interest. It's really created a common framework for collecting and analyzing the data and communicating the information. It spurred efforts to design a platform for a data warehouse based on some of the issues we came across as we were trying to pull the data, especially for the county system. The Secretary of EOPS has dedicated approximately $3.5 to $4.5 million in burn funding for evidence-based practices, and we'll be looking to roll this out and add language to our AGF in this coming year. The inventory process has really helped those involved to better understand the menu of programming at their agency and provides new data collection tools and a common framework for measuring the costs of programming. The legislature has appropriated state funds for 2 research positions to support the work of Results First. The Executive Office of Public Safety has used the cost-benefit results for the DOC programs, Department of Correction programs, to advocate during House and Senate budget negotiations for reentry programming. They've used, the Department of Correction has used the cost-benefit results and a gap analysis to change policies prohibiting certain offenders from lower security and to increase physical space for programs in order to get additional eligible offenders into programming. Additionally, the DOC is working to expand education programming from an academic year to a full year. So we've really begun to see the policy impact of our work in Massachusetts on Results First. Some of the Results First implementation challenges that we've encountered along the way are competing priorities, limited ability of personnel to focus solely on the Results First work, internalizing the model, its methodology and inputs takes time and repetition, finding the key people to work with at each agency to provide the cost and program data requires time, effort, and sometimes some fishing. And agencies have different IT systems and technical capacity. For example, there are 14 counties in Massachusetts, and the county corrections data is limited, and research and IT capacity and administrative support for Results First is varied. I'd like to finish up with some advice to states that might be thinking about implementing Results First or just starting up. So identify your policymaker champions. Who or what entity will play an advisory role, and who or what entity will promote the Results First work. Determine where the model will be housed in your state, which might depend on which policy areas you plan to include or which policy area you are starting with. So for us, we started in the criminal justice area. Identify your results first team and determine who will lead and staff each working group, document model inputs, and input the data. Work with Pew to provide training to key people on your team and have them attend the results first convening or any other cost-benefit trainings that are offered. Regular communication with working groups is critical, and try to include members with different expertise and backgrounds on your work groups. And use your work group expertise and the Pew team to think about how to capture the data or compile information needed for the model that might not be easily available. Look at what other states have done and who are challenged with similar situations. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, or if you'd like a copy of my PowerPoint. Here's my information, and now I'm going to turn this back over to Mark, our moderator, for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Mark. Those were both excellent presentations. I want to thank you, and Sarah as well, giving us a very good overview. I have a few questions that have come in, and I just want to remind you, if you have some questions, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of the screen, and please select host and presenter from the drop-down menu next to the text box. So I'd like to start off with Sarah with some overview issues with results first. Sarah, I wonder if you could comment, big picture, with the states that you're working with, are the goals the same for each state? Are there some states just looking to save taxpayer money while others are more interested in evidence-based policy making? And also, can you talk about the broader picture? What other social systems does results first address? It's not just criminal justice. Are there other areas that you're looking at, such as education or public health, that are utilizing these methods?
Sure. So the goals in every state and increasingly these California counties that we're working with are at the outset the same, and they're pretty basic. That it is to develop a customized, meaning a state-specific or county-specific cost-benefit model. And as Mark mentioned, that process takes a little while in order to gather all of the data needed to populate that model and then to customize it based on the way your state works. But that first takes about a year, which is what Mark said, and that's what we've seen across other states. But that first goal for all states that we've seen coming to us is help us develop our own state-specific version of this cost-benefit model. Then the second goal that all states have, and that we certainly have for states, is to use those models in real policy and budget decisions. This is, a really exciting tool, but we absolutely do not want it to just be seen as an academic exercise or a research exercise. So the points that Lisa made and that Mark made too about really starting from the top and getting that buy-in early and often is really critical to this process. And clearly, we can help in all of those areas. But I would say that the overarching big picture goals in every state are those two: to implement a customized version of the cost-benefit model, and then to use those results in real policy and budget decisions. Now, of course, there are, myriad variations on what those goals and sub-goals look like in every state, but they all are some variation of that. And I think Lisa made a great point that Massachusetts has seen a lot of kind of interim goals or maybe unexpected goals that have come up throughout the process. They've seen a lot of, this process has revealed a lot of data that I think folks didn't maybe know existed. They've created some new information that wasn't out there before. They've kind of reconnected this research group and formed other collaborations. So I think along the way, as states are seeing some interim successes, they're also setting additional goals in the process. And then as for other areas, as I mentioned, the model itself is currently capable of looking at adult and juvenile justice, and then also child welfare, pre-K to 12 education, substance abuse, and mental health. Some of those areas are a little more limited than others, but a handful of our states, specifically New Mexico, has already started down this path to implement into the other areas of the model, or I should say implement the other components of the model. Iowa, a few other states have just started down that road as well. And then our ongoing partnership with the Washington State Institute for Public Policy is looking to expand to other policy areas that are of interest to states, and the biggest one being healthcare. So we're working with the folks at WISDP over the next year or so to develop out a healthcare component of the model as well. So that's kind of part of what states are getting when they work with Results First. It's this ongoing expansion and development of the research base and of the tool as well.
Thank you. Mark and Lisa, I think as everyone has listened to your presentations and heard about the level of data gathering and analysis that goes in, there could be some questions about what the level of resource and time commitment is. I wonder if each of you could just take a minute to talk about the level of time commitments for a Results First partnership. What does it require from your agencies, from the partners that you're involved with, and where do you find the resources to help pay for this work? Mark, do you want to start off?
Certainly. This is definitely a time-intensive endeavor. For a good part of the implementation phase, we had 2 research staff working on this full-time, and also graduate level support from a partnership with a university as well. So, the assistance that we get from Pew-MacArthur is technical assistance and bringing together the states to interface with each other, which is also invaluable, but it's not Pew-MacArthur paying salaries to do this work that feeds the model or that operates the model. Once the model is populated and tested and validated, the resource requirements go down dramatically, and at that point it becomes more of a maintenance perspective from a technical component, and also then the job responsibility shifts more to policy analysis and working on making sure that the efforts of doing cost-benefit analysis maintain political traction. But it's definitely time-intensive, and it's something that I think to be done well, that a state has to commit resources to personnel that have a specific technical skill set, and also a level of comfortability with economics and finance to be able to both get this thing stood up and also to be able to make sure it gets sold in a way that policymakers are confident that it's being done in a sound way. Thanks.
Lisa, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I entirely agree with Mark. It's a very it's been a very, we've been into Results First here in Massachusetts for about 2 years, and we did not have dedicated staff on the project. And so for us, it's taken certainly a little bit longer than it has in certainly in New York to implement the model fully. And I believe that, you know, with the support from the legislature, you know, they've realized, and that's why we recently had 2 positions, money for 2 positions allocated by the legislature, and we're in the process of hiring exactly what Mark was talking about, some policy analysts that have that sort of economics, statistical, cost-benefit background, because that's really what it takes, at least in terms of having your main sort of leaders for your team. And then I do think that we've just been so fortunate in Massachusetts because we did have this sort of group of research, this research community that had, you know, had this long-established partnerships and had already done some of the work and that had laid the sort of groundwork for certainly the recidivism analysis. So again, it's been a little bit slower moving in Massachusetts. At points, we've had weekly phone calls with our recidivism team really for probably almost a year, where we were regularly checking in and everyone was working on different parts of the project to build the resource use data and the recidivism data needed for the model. So it's a lengthy process, but again, we've really seen some you know, really wonderful benefits from the work that we've done so far, and we're going to keep plugging away and get those 2 new people hired, and, you know, be exciting.
And in terms of supporting with resources, Sarah, is this assistance free to states? Is there any kind of in-kind match? Is there any sort of grant funding available?
No, there isn't. As Mark described, the assistance that we provide is more in kind. So it's lots of intensive technical assistance. Both Mark and Lisa have worked really closely with Steve Lees, who I think is actually on this webinar, so I'm not sure if he wants to jump in at any point. But we have 3 technical assistance providers across the country who really do focus on that technical side of populating the model. And then, as I mentioned, there's about 6 of us here at Pew who work on kind of connecting the dots between the technical and the policy side of things. So that's all intensive technical assistance resources that we provide. And then, of course, the model itself and all of the supporting materials. So we have a growing list of resources. We have user guides, different documentation forms, and as Mark mentioned, we recently did a webinar. We're continuing to develop our program inventory resources. One of my colleagues just recently did a comprehensive review of all of the clearinghouse databases nationally. So we're continuing to develop the resources that we provide states. But no, there's no exchange of funds. So it's not a grant application process. And the reason for that is because this truly is meant to be a capacity building initiative. This is not meant to be something that the Pew-MacArthur Foundation's grant money over, you know, different periods of time for a year here or there. We really want to make sure that this can be sustained well after we're gone. So things like what Lisa was describing with the Massachusetts legislature granting state funds for additional resources, that's exactly the sort of thing that that we support and we're working with states to do to really develop this as a capacity building initiative that can sustain for many years to come.
Okay. I have had some questions come in more relevant to the specific work that goes on. And one of them was inquiring about the recidivism work. And specifically, if the state has already used other methodologies to study recidivism, does it have to use the Pew method in definition, or can it continue to use its own? So for some of the states, recidivism may be framed in a narrower fashion, specifically in terms of return to prison. And certainly the model that you've talked about has a much more system-wide emphasis to it. Can you talk about what challenges a state might have and how they could reconcile that if their methodologies for studying recidivism differ from the Pew method?
I'd actually love Mark to take a shot at that. I think that's something that he and the New York team have worked through quite a bit. So, Mark, would you mind touching on that?
Surely. The results first model, the tool, the way it was built and validated originally in Washington State, is a felony conviction-based model. And because of that, the measure of recidivism, as defined for results first purposes, is any felony or misdemeanor, any reconviction within the follow-up period. In our case, our follow-up period starts with 5 years from release from state prison or 5 years from sentencing on our jail and our probation cohorts. But what we're looking for are those reconviction events. The reason why the model requires that is because it's factoring in and monetizing costs that are associated specifically with reconviction, such as police costs, court costs, prosecution costs, defense costs, and for other, other measures of recidivism, if you were using arrest, certainly a great portion of that would drop out without having those further system costs, which come down the line. Also excluded are technical violations. We, as a state, certainly do some of these other metrics of recidivism. We have rearrest recidivism metrics. Our Department of Corrections does have a return to incarceration metric as recidivism, but what is needed to actually feed the model has to be reconviction as the recidivism event. And the good news is that they're all pretty tightly correlated. We in New York are a little separate from the results first work. We were working on redoing a risk instrument, an actuarial risk tool that previously had been based on rearrest, and we changed it to be based on reconviction. And as part of the validation process, it was, I don't want to say uncanny because it actually was expected, but these are all largely correlated, how your recidivism trajectories would look depending on which measure you would use, but you'd actually have to do the work to generate those 5 measures of recidivism that the model requires to be able to monetize the behavior change and the expense and victimization change associated with that.
All right. I've had some questions about the data gathering aspect of the process and concerns about what happens if a state has difficulty finding the data necessary to feed the results first tool. Are there strategies for that? I know that Washington State has populated the tool with default data. To what extent can that information, that generic information, be utilized, and to what extent is it limited by its generic nature and needs to be replaced by state-specific figures?
So I can take a first shot at that, and I would actually, I think Steve Lees is on this webinar, and if he could maybe be unmuted, I think he might actually have something to add to this. So I'm happy to get it started, and Mark and Lisa, please jump in as well. But just to answer your question, Mark, every state that we've worked with has had challenges collecting this data. So it has, even for a state like New York where it's a centralized system, with access to a lot of great data, even they've had challenges. So it has not been an easy kind of plug and chug for anybody that we've worked with. So the good news is that we've been at this for about 3 years now, and we've developed a lot of resources and a lot of strategies for dealing with that. The model does come pre-populated with Washington State data. There are some benefits and certainly a lot of caveats to doing that. If your state, for example, looks a little bit more like Washington State than others, like Oregon, there are some benefits to maybe keeping in the data that you might not be able to collect on your own. But of course, the real benefit of this is having state-specific return on investment calculations. So we do try to work with states to collect as much of their own data as they can, especially if it's a state that does not look anything like Washington, especially in terms of the recidivism curves and the cost information. Jason, is Steve unmuted by chance?
Steve's on voice over IP, so unless he joins with a phone, he cannot be heard.
Okay, got it. So that's the basic answer. Do Mark and Lisa have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can just add that, we have definitely had, some challenges with getting some of the data for the model, and this is where it's been really key to have Steve, our technical consultant, involved in on our calls, because he's been able to give advice and through experience with other states, help us to figure out ways that we can come up with estimates or sort of be resourceful about what other sources of data we have and how we gather and collect some of that information. So I think that there's key information certainly that's needed for the model, but there are some areas where we've been able to either take Washington State's data and add some estimation processes to that, or sort of develop other sources of data to get at the answers.
I've had one participant ask about, in reference to the fact, Sarah, that you noted that there were a couple localities, I believe in California, that are implementing the Results First model. This individual is wondering if there's major differences in implementing the model in counties versus for the state.
Mm-hmm. There certainly are, and I should say that the work in California is at the county level purely because of realignment. So we are not at Results First planning to get into a whole heck of a lot of local work. It's what works in California based on the system there. So that's the reason why we're working in California counties. At this point, we don't have plans to go broadly into county work across the country. So all of that said, yes, it varies greatly. At this point, we are piloting the work in 3 to 5 counties. We're in 3 now. We may go up to 2 more. And the idea is really just to, first of all, figure out if this can work at the county level. Clearly, there are major differences between state-run programs and county-run programs and the data available to each. So I would be happy to talk with that individual offline more specifically about our work in California and how the work differs. But the shorter answer is that, yes, it does differ quite a bit, and we are still in the pretty early stages of figuring out strategies to address that.
Okay. We're going to have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. But before I ask these, we're going to open up a poll, and would appreciate your participation. This is very helpful to get your feedback. Want to ask about some of the major benefits that have come from engaging in this work. For the state speakers in particular, Mark and Lisa, now that you have all these data, would you consider using them for other research purposes? Do they have a broader set of uses now that you've been able to expand out your data knowledge base per se? What other uses do you see using these data for?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that first, and say that it's been very useful to us that it is not just the work as the results first technical cost benefit tool, but really the results first process of identifying programming that works and that's cost effective as kind of a way of doing business that has allowed us to do a lot of spin-off type of work. In our case, some of the spin-off work, I already mentioned the validation of a risk instrument. We've also used some of the information that has gone into Results First to piggyback with some raise the age research we're doing here in New York State, and also for some ATI work. So it certainly there's a lot of overlap in putting together the data that feeds the model, and it's very enlightening to us as well. Like I said, with New York, it has always had pretty robust research capabilities, and it's something that has always gotten a lot of traction here. But even so, this has really forced us to look deeper into some of the nuances, and so it's been very very informative to us, and it's helping us drive some of these other things, such like I said, such as raised age, fidelity, evaluations of programming that already exists. It's actually it's kind of got a catalytic component to it, in that several other areas that we're working on have really been kind of jump-started by the Results First efforts as well.
Lisa, did you have anything else to add?
Just, we're still sort of in the throes of pulling together the information for Results First. So I guess I'm a little bit at the, looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. But, I know that we've discussed as a group, our research group has talked about, really needing to come together and look at what, we've amassed this huge data file. I talked about the 44,000 records, and, to really think about the research agenda around looking at that data. And, I talked about some of the benefits of Results First, just in terms of it being, a really good tool for pulling together the program inventory information and the data associated with that. So, our plan is to continue to utilize it, but we're sort of in the sort of middle phase of really just trying to, produce some briefs on the data that we've gathered so far.
All right. Well, we're about out of time. I would like to thank our speakers, Sarah Dubé, Mark Shopsis, and Lisa Sampson, as well as everyone in the audience for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and that you'll join us for future webinars. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Mark, can I just add one thing? I'm not sure if this has been clear throughout the presentation today, but Results First is definitely still talking with prospective states that might be interested in working with us down the road. So please don't hesitate to contact me if you'd like to discuss your state further.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.